In a dusty Oklahoma City law office in November 1932, attorneys sorting through the estate of Jonathan Edward Rothwell made a peculiar discovery. Rolled inside a leather map case, they found a document 12 feet long and 5 feet wide, a sprawling genealogical chart unlike anything they'd seen before. But this wasn't a family tree of people. It was a family tree of oil wells. And according to the penciled notes in the margins, this bizarre diagram, drawn 7 years earlier, had predicted the price of crude oil with unsettling accuracy. What happened in Oklahoma between 1925 and 1932 remains one of American capitalism's strangest episodes, a story where geological science, corporate warfare, and something resembling mysticism collided in the oil fields of the Southern Plains.
To understand Jonathan Rothwell's theory, you must first understand Oklahoma in 1925. The state was barely 18 years old, but already it stood as the nation's leading oil producer. Derricks pierced the skyline in Tulsa, which locals called the oil capital of the world. In towns like Drumright, Seminole, and Tonkawa, wooden oil derricks stood so close together they looked like a mechanical forest. Fortunes appeared overnight. A farmhand could lease mineral rights one month and buy a mansion the next. But the boom was also chaos. Unlike the Rockefeller-dominated oil fields of Pennsylvania and Texas, Oklahoma's petroleum landscape was fractured among hundreds of independent operators. Small companies, family concerns, and wildcatters fought for leases, drilling rights, and market share. The geology itself seemed capricious. One well might gush while another 50 feet away came up dry. In this environment of speculation and uncertainty, men looked for any advantage, any system that might decode the Earth's secrets. Jonathan Rothwell was not a geologist. He was a lease broker, a middleman who bought and sold drilling rights. By most accounts, he was successful but unremarkable. A man in his late 40s with an office on Cincinnati Avenue in Tulsa, a modest home in the developing neighborhood of Maple Ridge, and no particular reputation for eccentricity. Until the summer of 1925.
What exactly happened that summer remains unclear. Rothwell's secretary, Margaret Hollis, later claimed he'd spent weeks poring over geological surveys and production records, barely sleeping. His business partner, Charles Denning, said Rothwell had become obsessed with connections, tracing lines between wells on maps, muttering about inheritance and lineage. Whatever the catalyst, by August 1925, Rothwell had developed a theory that would consume him and destabilize Oklahoma's oil industry. His claim was simple, radical, and seemingly absurd. Oil fields were not independent geological formations, but rather existed in hereditary relationships. Each oil deposit, Rothwell argued, was the descendant of an older, parent field. The oil itself migrated through underground channels over geological time, creating family lines that could be traced, mapped, and, most importantly, predicted. A well wasn't just a hole in the ground. It had ancestors, siblings, offspring. Rothwell began creating his diagram, using production data, geological reports, and what he called flow intuition. He drew connecting lines between wells across Oklahoma and into Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas. The diagram grew. Wells became nodes. Lines became relationships. Solid lines for direct descent. Dotted lines for collateral lineage. Double lines for what Rothwell called powerful heredity. He assigned each well a generation number and a pedigree designation. The Glen Pool field was Generation 1, Line Alpha. Newer wells became Gen 2, Gen 3, down through multiple generations.
Rothwell didn't publish his theory in geological journals. He pitched it to oil companies as a competitive advantage. And here's where the story takes its peculiar turn. Some of them listened. In September 1925, Rothwell presented his pedigree theory to the board of Continental Prairie Oil, a mid-sized Tulsa company struggling against larger competitors. The pitch was seductive. If Continental could identify which wells had superior lineage, they could predict which drilling sites would prove most productive. They could acquire leases to descendant fields before anyone else recognized the connection. The company signed a consulting contract with Rothwell worth $15,000, substantial money in 1925. Within weeks, word spread. Rothwell met with representatives from Marland Oil, Indian Territory Illuminating Oil, and half a dozen smaller concerns. Some dismissed him as a crank. Others, perhaps desperate for any edge in the volatile market, took him seriously. By early 1926, at least 4 companies had paid Rothwell for access to portions of his diagram and his pedigree analysis of potential drilling sites.
This is where competitive capitalism turned destructive. If oil wells had pedigrees, if some wells were senior in the lineage and others junior, then proving your company's fields were the ancestors of your competitors' fields meant something. It meant legitimacy. It meant you could claim, at least in Rothwell's framework, a kind of primacy over the oil itself. In the spring of 1926, strange events began occurring across Oklahoma's oil fields. Equipment failures that looked like sabotage, drilling records that went missing from company offices, sample cores that disappeared from geological surveys. Continental Prairie accused Marland of tampering with their drill sites. Marland claimed Continental was spreading false information about field boundaries to manipulate Rothwell's diagram. The violence, when it came, was limited but real. In June 1926, a fire destroyed a storage facility belonging to Indian Territory Illuminating in Creek County. Company officials blamed rivals trying to obscure production records, the very records Rothwell used to establish lineage. In August, a consulting geologist named Howard Bixby was beaten outside a Tulsa speakeasy, his briefcase stolen. Bixby had been working with Rothwell. The briefcase contained annotated maps. Oklahoma newspapers covered the incidents but missed the connecting thread. To most observers, this was just the rough-and-tumble business of oil, industrial espionage taken to unfortunate extremes. Only those inside the pedigree circle understood what was actually happening. Companies were literally fighting over the genealogy of underground petroleum.
By 1927, Jonathan Rothwell had become reclusive. He'd moved from his Tulsa office to a farmhouse outside Sapulpa, where he continued expanding his diagram. The chart now covered multiple sheets mounted on the walls of a barn. Visitors reported that Rothwell had added color coding, numerical sequences, and what appeared to be predictive annotations, dates and numbers that corresponded to nothing currently observable. Margaret Hollis, his former secretary, visited him that winter. She later described Rothwell as not insane, but not entirely present either, as if he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. He told her the diagram was complete, that he'd finally seen the entire pattern. He spoke about pressure inheritance and temporal migration, terms that appeared in no geological textbook. On March 14, 1928, Jonathan Rothwell died of pneumonia. He was 52. His estate passed to a distant cousin in Missouri who had no interest in oil. The diagram, along with Rothwell's papers, went into storage. The companies that had invested in Rothwell's theory quietly moved on. The pedigree concept was not mentioned in board meetings or shareholder reports. By 1929, as the stock market crashed and oil prices collapsed, the entire episode seemed like an embarrassing footnote to the boom years.
a time when money and desperation had made reasonable men entertain unreasonable ideas. But in 1932, when those attorneys unrolled Rothwell's diagram, they noticed something that would keep this story alive for decades. In the margins, next to various descendant fields, Rothwell had written prices: 1.25 per barrel, fall 1929. 0.65 per barrel, spring 1931. 0.95 per barrel, summer 1932. The attorneys compared these notations to actual historical prices. They matched, not approximately, exactly. Fields Rothwell had designated as Gen 4, weak lineage, had indeed produced during periods of low prices. Fields marked Gen 3, strong heredity, had peaked during price spikes. The correlation was remarkable, impossible even.
How do we explain this? Several theories have emerged over the years, each with its own adherents. The coincidence theory. Rothwell made dozens of predictions across hundreds of wells. Some were bound to align with actual prices simply by chance. We remember the hits and forget the misses, a cognitive bias as old as prophecy itself. The geological insight theory. Perhaps Rothwell, despite his unorthodox terminology, had stumbled upon legitimate geological relationships. Modern petroleum geology recognizes that oil deposits migrate through permeable rock layers. Maybe Rothwell's pedigrees were an intuitive, if unscientific, way of mapping these genuine underground connections. His predictions worked because he'd correctly identified productive field relationships, and production levels correlate with prices. The market manipulation theory. The darker interpretation suggests that companies consulting with Rothwell used his diagram as a cover for coordinated production manipulation. If several companies agreed to limit output from junior lineage fields while maximizing senior wells, they could influence prices while claiming they were simply following Rothwell's geological framework. His predictions worked because they were actually a plan. The lost data theory. Some researchers believe Rothwell had access to information we can't verify, perhaps unpublished geological surveys or insider knowledge from his lease broker days about planned drilling operations. He extrapolated trends that others missed, disguising solid market analysis in mystical language. He projected with uncanny accuracy, but did not explain his technique. Could someone else do it as well?
Here's the challenge for investigators. Rothwell's original papers were lost in a fire at a Missouri storage facility in 1947. We have only secondary descriptions of the diagram, sketches made by the attorneys in 1932, partial photographs published in a 1955 Oklahoma Historical Society bulletin, and conflicting testimonies from people who claim to have seen it. We cannot examine Rothwell's methodology. We cannot verify which predictions were genuine versus later additions. We cannot even be certain the diagram existed exactly as described. What we can verify is this. Oklahoma oil companies in 1925 to 1927 did pay a consultant named Jonathan Rothwell. Equipment sabotage and industrial espionage did occur in those years. Oil prices did fluctuate in specific patterns between 1928 and 1932. And people in the Oklahoma oil industry did quietly discuss Rothwell's chart for decades afterward, usually in tones that mixed skepticism with something approaching awe.
Today, in certain corners of Oklahoma, in the coffee shops of Tulsa's Deco District, in the company offices that still pump oil from Depression-era wells, you'll occasionally hear someone mention the Rothwell pedigrees. Usually it's a joke, a bit of industry folklore. But sometimes, especially when prices swing unexpectedly
or a new field comes in stronger than projected, someone will say, maybe old Rothwell was on to something. The truth is, we'll probably never know. Jonathan Rothwell was either a charlatan who got lucky, a savant who saw patterns others missed, a frontman for price fixing, or something stranger still, a man who convinced himself so thoroughly of an impossible idea that reality briefly bent to accommodate him. American capitalism has room for all these stories. What remains is the image, a 12-foot diagram of wells and connecting lines, drawn by a man who believed the Earth's oil had memory and inheritance, hanging in a barn outside Sapulpa, Oklahoma, while companies sabotaged each other in pursuit of ancestral petroleum. Whether you call it conspiracy, delusion, or forgotten genius, it tells you something true about the American hunger for patterns in chaos, for meaning in the machinery of fortune. The oil fields are still there, the derricks are mostly gone, and somewhere in the underground darkness, petroleum moves through ancient stone, following rules that Jonathan Rothwell claimed to understand in a language no one has spoken since.